passers-by to read about their need and hopefully to respond by giving food or money. His literacies, or ways of knowing and being, are not only cognitive, not just recognizing that there's class marginalization and deprivation of some kind, but these literacies are also a visceral knowing, an embodied literacy entangled with affect. Our social class literacies, and I would argue all literacies, are always embodied and visceral and affective, just as they are cognitive and perceptive. A material discursive apparatuses and the literacies produced through them are constantly in motion, and even one change can reconfigure the literacies altogether. For example, what if Robert's grandmother responded with, "These lazy beggars need to go get a job," rather than her more typical discourse of, "God bless him. I hope he has a place to stay tonight." The literacies produced in that material discursive space are very different, very different. So places, I'll come back to places. I'm gonna check my time too, excuse me. Places are profoundly pedagogical. They are material discursive apparatuses of production. They produce meanings, which become literacies that we use for making sense. In other words, different places produce different kinds of literacies. And different places are produced by different ways of the material and the discursive coming together to form what becomes possible or impossible. All places, then, are teaching us something. And I want to switch here from the social class literacies produced in public spaces, like a shopping mall in the side of the road, to places that are specifically designed with young learners in mind, intentional learning spaces. I would argue that placemaking for and with learners is one of the most profoundly pedagogical and political practice that educators will be involved with. It can be an intentional reconfiguring of a material discursive space. The next stories are about a learning space in Robert's neighborhood, the neighborhood that we call South Woods in our research. It's a neighborhood perceived by many outsiders as dangerous, dirty, scary, and filled with criminal activity. My colleagues and I have spent the past 5 years there leading the informal learning space. Now we call it the Playhouse. Parents and young people alike in the neighborhood were quick to tell us that their neighborhood was dangerous. And the material discursive apparatus of the already existing community center before it was the Playhouse produced literacies that were in line with that perception. The program that was in place in the building had installed metal bars on the windows, even though none of the other homes in the community had bars on the windows. Heavy padlocks and chains were locking the gates to the backyard, and there were signs alerting people living in the neighborhood that there was an alarm system on the building. Therefore, I would say that the materiality and the discursivity of the community center were important apparatuses of place literacies, or how we come to perceive and talk about and engage with a place. These are intricately connected to literacies of race, social class, and the hierarchy of people and place. Our work from the beginning has been an attempt to engage in intentional place-making with young people to open up and reconfigure expansive literacies. We hope to produce a shift in the deficit perspectives acquired by children and adults about the place where they lived their lives. In other words, the material discursive apparatus of what we now call the playhouse produces ways of being and knowing, literacies that could produce more ethical and egalitarian ways of being together. It was week 1 in our summer when the Playhouse wasn't quite the Playhouse. 5 summers ago, it was the changing of the stage where one group was closing down shop and another was slowly tiptoeing in. We walked the fence line and the modest playground in the backyard. It had been secured with big, dangling metal chains and steel-keyed locks. All the children had gone home for the evening and have no hope of re-entering the playground through the traditional means. To re-enter, they will need to climb up and over the fences, something we watch them do a lot. When they're locked in, the children climb out. And when they're locked out, the children climb in. Earlier that day, when the children were present, family members stood at the gates talking to their kids as if miles divided them, although only inches of metal separated them. The kids might jump the fence, but the adults who lived there never did. When we asked the former director about the locks, we were told, we need to keep the kids in and the bad people out. We found this rather curious, because the only people on the outside were family members of the children who were in. The chains and locks produce literacies of social class, race, belonging or not belonging. Jane Bennett uses the concept of thing power to express the agency these objects have, which in this case encourage the monitoring of the playground and the surveillance of bodies, Black and brown bodies from working class and wage-poor families. But here's the thing, it's not just about the playhouse and that community and the social class literacies produced around the chains and the bars and the locks in that place. These material discursive apparatuses are linked to national apparatuses as well. These objects fortify a criminalization of the working class and wage-poor Black and brown children and families living around the fences. But this is an apparatus that produces racialized and social class literacies in the United States that have become taken for granted. These literacies feed our imaginations with material discursive ideas about poor people. They are the apparatuses through which we make sense of social class and poverty, and then start to agree with policies that injure the people. In fact, in the United States, African American boys and men are in jail at a much higher rate than any other group. Immigrants, particularly those deemed less than, and in our area, that tends to be folks from Mexico, are detained in private for-profit detention centers. And of course, poor people from all racial and ethnic backgrounds are more likely to be in jails of all kinds. Bars, chains, fences, and locks are a recognizable part of a broad societal material discursive apparatus that tells us how to make sense of poor people as not quite human, potentially criminal, and in need of being contained or restricted. As Bradati reminds us, tending to the powerful and interdependent material, discursive, and symbolic forces of social and political practices can help us reimagine a more ethical way of being and doing. The fences, chains, bars, and locks are not neutral objects, but rather active agents in the literacies that children and adults had acquired about the place of the playhouse and the surrounding neighborhood. Eventually, the chains came off that summer. It took time and finesse, but within a few days, the gates were free to swing open, and the kids could run in and out. The playground didn't feel as closed in or as exclusionary, as Barad might say. The opening of the gates seemed to welcome the playground to the rest of the neighborhood, and vice versa. But just as it takes time to create a material discursive apparatus, so it takes time to reconfigure them into something different. With the gates opened, children whirled by as they had the day before when the chains were in place. They chased each other across the playscape, stopping at the fence line on the other side of the yard as if the locks were still there. Families continued to stand on the other side of the fence to talk to their children, even though the gates were open. Removal of the chains and locks then did not immediately change social practices or the literacies, what we would say are ways of being, doing, and thinking in a particular place. These didn't change for quite a while. And although the locks and chains were neither our rule nor a practice that we wanted to continue, the literacies that they had produced persisted even when the material discursive conditions started to change. Eventually, children started using the rest of the neighborhood as an extension of the playhouse and vice versa, rather than feeling forced to stay inside the fence when the playhouse was open and outside the fence when the playhouse was closed. After many weeks and months, families started to come to the playhouse more often. And now, 5 years later, moms, dads, grandpas, grandmas, aunts, uncles, they walk to the playground like they've been doing it all along. No hesitation. Indeed, different social and political ways of being together emerged, and we would argue these are more ethical ways of being in relation to one another, and not reproductions of unjust literacies around social class and race. So these race and class literacies are not only acquired about the place of South Woods by outside visitors, they're also acquired in complex ways by the people who live there. Neighborhood residents had told us their perceptions about their own community, that it was dangerous, a place to be feared, or they would tell us that they resented that outsiders thought that about their neighborhood. While we have no way of knowing what, if any, role the reconfigured apparatus played, several adult residents over the years have said things to us like, "This used to be a dangerous place, but it's not anymore." What once were apparatuses that produced children and adults as bodies that needed to be controlled and regulated because of their presumed criminal disposition, now worked to produce them as creative, trustworthy, capable, and curious people. A sense of belonging and equity was also reconfigured when all children and families in the neighborhood had access to the playhouse. The redesigned playhouse was what we call a maker space. I'm not sure if that's a concept in Chile. And we wanted to ensure more fluidity and better accessibility by being free of charge, so the children and families never had to pay anything. The program that was running the center before us charged fees to attend, and therefore families might live right next door to the building but never be able to access the activities. This is common in the United States. Accessibility to after-school programs are limited to those who have resources, economic resources, transportation, English, writing and reading literacies to register their children. Furthermore, the concept of maker spaces, which are creative, open, exploratory spaces for young people, are often costly and they're found in more affluent spaces. After-school centers that focus on creativity and special interest are not typically accessible by working class and poor children. And I'll just add, I'm not sure about the context where you work, but a lot of the after-school programs for working class and poor children are more focused on what they would call the basics. More reading, more writing, more testing, and preparing them to get better scores and better grades in school. So we would argue that even just having access to creative materials and the freedom to use materials in exploratory ways has reconfigured the material discursive apparatus and the literacies that are produced about Southwoods, the neighborhood, and the children and families who live there. Many outsiders now, 5 years later, have heard stories about how creative the children are there, how innovative they are, how intelligent they are, how brilliant they are. And they talk positively about the free maker space that's available to them, and about the ethic that guides the work there, that's focused on placemaking with and for young people to expand all kinds of literacies, including those about social class, poverty, and education. I wrote part of this paper in a restaurant. And I overheard a conversation. I love that. It's like the beauty of being a writer. There's material everywhere. The bartender was talking to two people eating lunch at the bar. They were talking about meritocracy and critiquing the idea that meritocracy is, that the United States is a meritocracy. They were talking about the idea that if those who have been rewarded by a system had worked hard, then those rewards were deserved. And if those who were suffering in the system of a true meritocracy, then their suffering is also deserved. That's essentially what a meritocracy says. But these three people were critiquing this. This is another material discursive story that's told about social class, of course. But right there in that restaurant, three ordinary people were telling a different kind of social class story. They were producing new social class literacies through a material discursive apparatus that includes evidence that they see that wages have stagnated, that the quality of living is decreasing, that economic instability and insecurity is more common than not. This apparatus also includes discourses about work and workers in the United States. We have had statewide teacher strikes, massive protests of millions of people against policies that dehumanize immigrants and profile and kill racial minorities. The Black Lives Matter movement aims for economic justice as well as racial justice. human and economic rights for women, youth, and those marginalized because of their gendered identities and the poor. And of course, protests against mass shootings in our schools. Another one happened yesterday. The people who are reconfiguring these social class literacies know that even when we have mass shootings at schools, there is a corporate answer, and that answer is to sell more guns and teach teachers how to use them. The bad news about this conception of literacies and the configuring and reconfiguring of social class literacies is that material discursive apparatuses are always changing. They're dynamic. And there are always dominant apparatuses in every country that are manufacturing stories and literacies about poor people because they have something to gain from the exploitation of the most vulnerable people. But the fact that material discursive apparatuses, and that means the literacies that become intelligible to us, are indeed always shifting and changing is also the good news. We are always in the act of reconfiguring apparatuses. We can be intentional about the making material and discursive shifts to tell different stories and make new literacies possible. This conference, actually, is a terrific example of just that. This is a reconfigured apparatus, a material discursive space that has been intentionally designed for us to come together and create new literacies about social class, poverty, and education. Viviana said this in her opening. We don't have to be isolated. And when we create apparatuses for people to come together, new things emerge. New possibilities come to be. We have to remember, of course, that even when we help to reconfigure literacies, they're still not stable. The rain will come again, creating a new material discursive apparatus with our gardens. And those of us who dare will be the ones bailing the water out of the flower patches, reconfiguring places, spaces, discourses, and the materiality of everyday lives to make something just more possible. We will remember that young seeds that have not seen sun forget and drown easily.